The November wind had teeth. It bit through Frank Miller's worn canvas jacket, gnawing right down to the bone as he stood in the frozen mud of what used to be Jim Henderson's farmyard. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant was a funeral dirge for a lifetime of work. Each yep and sold another shovelful of dirt on the coffin of a family farm. Frank kept his hands jammed in his pockets, one calloused fist clenched around 4 worn $20 bills and a 10. $90. That was his limit. He wasn't here for the big-ticket items. He watched with a grim set to his jaw as Henderson's John Deere 40-4-30, barely 3 years old and still gleaming under the weak winter sun, went for a price that made his stomach turn. The man who bought it, Richard Peterson, didn't even look like he was concentrating. He just lifted a single finger, a casual gesture that added another $1,000 to the bid, his face locked in a confident smirk. Peterson was young, maybe 30, with soft hands and a brand-new Ford F-250 Ranger parked near the road, its chrome bumper mocking the rust-pocked fenders of the other pickups. Frank ignored him. He was here for the boneyard, the rows of discarded and forgotten iron that lay behind the main shed. Specifically, he was looking for the guts of an old Gleaner E combine that Henderson had cannibalized for parts years ago. Frank's own Gleaner, a Model E3 he'd bought for cash after his father passed, was his pride and joy. But she was getting on in years. The variable speed drive on the cylinder had been getting sloppy, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who lives by the seasons, that it wouldn't last another harvest. Henderson's junked machine had the parts he needed. The auctioneer, a portly man named Gus, with a voice like gravel in a coffee can, finally moved toward the scrap heaps. "All right, folks, for you parts men and tinkerers, we're going to sell this next row choice. You pick the piece, you make the bid." This was Frank's moment. He saw it, half buried in the weeds, the unmistakable silver housing of the Gleaner's main drive assembly. It was greasy, and a mouse had built a nest in the cooling fins, but the casting looked solid. "Who'll start me at $20 on choice of the pile?" Gus bellowed. Frank's hand shot up. "Here. Got 20 from Frank Miller, a man who knows value. Who'll give me 30? $30 bill. 30, 30, 30. A crisp voice cut through the chant. 50. Frank's head snapped around. It was Peterson, leaning against the side of the barn, a clean Stetson tilted back on his head. He wasn't even looking at the parts pile. He was looking right at Frank, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Gus's face lit up. $50 from Mr. Peterson. Now we got an auction. Who'll go 60? Come on, Frank. Don't let him take your prize." Frank's jaw tightened. Peterson didn't need this part. He ran a brand new John Deere 70-100, a green monster with an air-conditioned cab and a price tag bigger than Frank's entire farm. This was just a game for him, a way to show off. The other farmers shuffled their feet, watching. They knew it, too. 60, Frank said, his voice low and steady. He pulled the bills from his pocket, smoothing them out against his leg. 70, Peterson shot back instantly, not even waiting for the auctioneer. The air grew thick. This wasn't about a piece of old machinery anymore. It was about pride. It was about two different ways of looking at the world. Frank saw a tool to be maintained, a resource to be husbanded. Peterson saw a disposable asset on a balance sheet. 80, Frank ground out. He could feel the sweat trickle down his back despite the cold. That was almost his whole wad. Peterson chuckled, a low, condescending sound. 90. Frank stood there, the wind whipping his hair across his forehead. He looked at the part, then at Peterson's smug face. He thought of the hours he'd spend pulling the old drive, cleaning the grease, fitting the replacement. He thought of doing it himself, on his own concrete floor, with his own tools. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of bringing an old machine back to life, of not owing a single dime to any bank for the privilege. Then he looked at Peterson again, a man who probably paid a dealership mechanic $200 just to change his oil, and Frank knew he couldn't let him win. Not this. $100, Frank said, his voice ringing out with a finality that surprised even himself. He had another 10 in his pocket, but he said it like it was his last dollar on earth. Peterson held his gaze for a long moment. The smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. He pushed himself off the barn, took a step forward, and then stopped. He shook his head slowly, a little laugh escaping his lips. "Let the man have his junk," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He turned and walked away toward the bigger machinery, the crowd parting for him like he was a king. "Sold!" Gus yelled, banging his fist on a rusty fender. "For $100 to Frank Miller!" Frank walked forward and handed Gus the crumpled bills. He didn't care about the whispers or the stares. He heaved the heavy gearbox assembly out of the weeds, the cold, greasy metal, a reassuring weight in his arms. It was more than he'd wanted to pay, $100 he didn't really have to spare. But it was his. He owned it. Free and clear. As he carried it back to his old Chevy C10, the pickup his father had bought new in '62, he felt a grim satisfaction. Peterson could have his new tractors and his easy credit. Frank had his land, paid for by his grandfather. He had his tools, paid for with his own sweat. And he had this greasy $100 part that would keep his old combine running. In his world, that was a victory. He drove home as the sun set, the sky turning a bruised purple over the flat, empty fields of central Illinois. The drive assembly rattled in the truck bed behind him. He knew the work that lay ahead, the cold hours in the unheated shed, wrestling with seized bolts and brittle gaskets. But that was the price of independence. It was a price he was willing to pay. Before we go any further, I've got to ask you folks, especially those of you who've turned a wrench or two in your time. What was the oldest, most stubborn piece of iron you ever had to count on to put food on the table? Was it an old tractor, a truck, a saw from your granddaddy? Let me know in the comments below. I'd sure like to hear about the machines that built this country, the ones that refused to die. Back on his farm, Frank eased the Chevy into the main shed, its headlights cutting through the dusty gloom. His place wasn't fancy. The main barn, built by his grandfather with hand-hewn timbers, leaned a little to the north. The machine shed was a simple pole and tin affair he'd put up himself. But inside, everything was in its place. Tools hung on the walls, their outlines drawn in black marker, so he knew exactly where each wrench and socket belonged. In the center of the floor sat his main tractor, a John Deere 4020. It wasn't new, a '68 model he'd bought used from a retiring farmer 10 years back, but it was arguably one of the finest tractors Deere ever built. He'd paid cash, a little every month for 2 years until it was his. Its big 6-cylinder diesel engine was as reliable as the sunrise, and in the far bay, under a canvas tarp, sat the gleaner. She wasn't pretty. Her silver paint was faded and streaked with rust where the rain had gotten to it. The decals were peeling, but Frank knew her every quirk, every groan and squeal. He knew that if you didn't let the engine warm up for a full 10 minutes on a cold morning, she'd foul a plug. He knew the precise spot on the unloading auger you had to hit with a hammer to get the grain flowing if the beans were wet. He and that machine had an understanding, a partnership forged over thousands of acres and countless hours of dust and sweat. He muscled the heavy drive assembly out of the truck bed and set it on his workbench. He clicked on the single bare bulb that hung overhead, its yellow light casting long shadows. He laid out his tools, a 3/4-inch drive socket set, a breaker bar, a can of penetrating oil. The air in the shed was cold and smelled of diesel, old grease, and damp earth. To Frank, it was the smell of home. He cracked his knuckles, took a deep breath, and set to work, the quiet scrape of steel on steel the only sound in the winter darkness. The following autumn, the corn stood tall and heavy in the fields, the ears hanging low, their husks dry and papery. It was a good year, one of the best Frank had seen. The weather had cooperated, the rains coming right when they were needed. He'd spent the last days of September getting the Gleaner ready, tuning the engine, greasing every Zerk fitting until the old grease was pushed out by the new, and installing the rebuilt drive assembly he'd bought at the Henderson auction. It had taken him most of the winter, working by the dim light of that single bulb, but he'd stripped it down, replaced the bearings, put in new seals, and painted it the original Gleaner silver. It ran smoother than it had in years. He was halfway through his second field of beans, the sun warm on his back, the familiar roar of the Gleaner's Alice Chalmers 6-cylinder engine, a comforting drone. The dust billowed up behind him, a golden cloud that coated everything in a fine powder. He was in the zone, his hand resting lightly on the header control, his eyes scanning the crop ahead, his ears tuned to the rhythm of the machine. He could tell by the pitch of the cylinder when the beans were getting a little tough, and he'd back off the ground speed just a touch. It was a dance, a conversation between man and machine. Then he heard it. Not a bang, not a crash, but a sudden, sharp thwack, followed by a high-pitched metallic scream and the smell of burning rubber. Frank's blood ran cold. He yanked the throttle back and slammed the header disengage lever forward. The whole machine shuddered to a halt, the sudden silence deafening. A plume of blue smoke curled up from the left side of the combine. He knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, that this was bad. He climbed down from the operator's platform, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. The main separator drive belt, a massive, thick band of rubber and cord, had snapped. But it hadn't just broken. In its final, whipping death throes, it had flailed around and smashed into the main variable speed sheave assembly. He could see the damage immediately. The outer sheave, a heavy cast-iron pulley nearly 2 feet in diameter, was cracked clean in two. A jagged piece of it lay on the ground amidst the soybean stubble. Frank swore, a single harsh word that was swallowed by the vast open field. This wasn't a simple belt replacement. That cast-iron sheave was a main component, a part that hadn't been manufactured in over a decade. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the combine's side panel and closed his eyes. The sun was shining, the beans were ready, and his harvest had just come to a dead stop. Every hour he was down was an hour the weather could turn. An early snow, a week of rain. It could ruin the whole crop. He spent the rest of the afternoon taking it apart. The work was brutal. The sheave was keyed onto a heavy steel shaft, and years of rust and grime had practically welded it in place. He soaked it in penetrating oil, heated it with his acetylene torch until it glowed cherry red, and beat on it with a 10-pound sledgehammer until his arms felt like jelly. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, it broke free. He wrestled the heavy, broken pieces back to his workshop. The next 2 days were a blur of frustration. He called every implement dealer within 100 miles. The response was always the same. "A Gleaner E? Sorry, pal. We don't carry parts for anything that old. Maybe try a salvage yard." The younger parts men didn't even know what a Gleaner E was. They'd just type the number into their computer terminals and shake their heads. "Nope. System says it's obsolete." Meanwhile, the world kept turning. Rich Peterson's brand new 7700, running with its lights on well into the night, finished his beans and started on his corn. Every time Frank drove into town for coffee or a bolt from the hardware store, he'd see the dust cloud from Peterson's operation on the horizon. He could feel the eyes of the other farmers on him at the co-op. He could hear the unspoken words, the pitying looks. Poor Frank, still trying to make a go of it with that old junk, should have traded it in when he had the chance. The local gossip mill, lubricated by morning coffee at the town diner, was running at full steam. "Heard Frank Miller's broke down for good this time," one old-timer would say. "Saw him beating on that old combine of his with a sledgehammer." Never a good sign. On the third day, after calling a dozen salvage yards from a payphone, his pockets full of dimes, he finally got a lead. A place called Rusty's Iron Pile, 3 counties to the west. The owner, a gravelly-voiced man named Rusty, said he might have one. "Can't be sure," he'd rasped over the phone. "Got a whole row of old gleaners back in the weeds. You'd have to come pull it yourself." Frank didn't hesitate. He threw his tools in the back of the Chevy, filled a thermos with black coffee, and started driving. The salvage yard was a metal graveyard, a sprawling testament to broken dreams and busted iron. Combines, tractors, and plows from generations past sat in silent, rusting rows, slowly being consumed by the earth. Frank spent 4 hours wading through thigh-high weeds and thorn bushes, fighting off wasps and spiders, until he found it. A Gleaner E, even older than his, its engine missing, its tires rotted away. But the sheave was still there. It took him another 3 hours of sweat and swearing to get it off. The bolts were frozen solid with rust. He broke 2 wrenches and skinned every knuckle on both hands. But as the sun began to dip low, he finally worked it free. He paid Rusty $40 for the part, a price that felt like a steal after the fight he'd put up. He drove home in the dark, exhausted but triumphant, the precious piece of cast iron wrapped in greasy rags on the seat beside him. The forecast on the radio was calling for rain, a big system moving in from the west, due in 2 days. The race was on. He didn't stop at the house. He pulled straight into the shed, flicked on the light, and went back to work, his hands raw, his body aching, fueled by nothing but black coffee and sheer, stubborn will. He got the combine back together just as the first drops of rain began to speckle the dust on his truck's windshield. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and caffeine. But the Gleaner was running. The rebuilt sheave, scavenged from a metal corpse, spun true. The rain held off, turning into a light drizzle that did little more than settle the dust. Frank climbed back into the operator's seat, the worn metal familiar beneath him, and pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared to life, and he eased the old machine back into the field. He ran all night, the combine's single headlight cutting a lonely path through the darkness. He ran all the next day, stopping only for fuel. He ate sandwiches his wife, Mary, brought out to the field, not even bothering to shut the engine down. He cut the last row of beans as the sun set on the second day, the grain tank full to the brim. He was bone-tired, caked in dirt and grease. But he'd done it. 80 acres of beans were safe in the bin. As he drove the combine back toward the barn, the sky to the west opened up, and the rain began to fall in earnest, a cold, hard November downpour. He sat in the cab for a long time, listening to the rain hammer on the tin roof of the machine, the engine ticking as it cooled. He'd won. It hadn't been pretty, and it sure as hell hadn't been easy. But he'd won. The next year, 1973, the world changed. Following President Nixon's visit to China and a massive crop failure in the Soviet Union, the United States negotiated what came to be known as the Great Russian Grain Deal. Suddenly, American farmers had a new, massive customer, and commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled. A wave of unprecedented prosperity washed over the heartland. The mantra coming from the universities and the Department of Agriculture was, "Get big or get out." Land prices soared. Farmers who had been cautious for a generation were suddenly being encouraged to expand, to modernize, to borrow, and the banks were more than happy to oblige. Interest rates were low, and loan officers who had once scrutinized every penny were now practically throwing money at anyone with a deed to a piece of dirt. Rich Peterson became the poster child for the new era. He was the golden boy of the county. He bought the old Henderson place he'd picked apart at the auction, adding another 240 acres to his operation. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 700 for the newest model, the 720, with more horsepower and a bigger grain tank. He bought a monstrous 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther tractor, an articulated beast that could pull a 30-foot field cultivator, turning over twice the acres in half the time. His line of new, green and yellow equipment parked in his yard looked like a dealership. The talk at the co-op was that his line of credit at the Farmers National Bank was over $1 million. He was seen as a visionary, a man with the guts to seize the opportunity. Frank had a good year, too. The high prices meant the grain he'd fought so hard to harvest was worth a fortune. For the first time in his life, he had a significant surplus after all his bills were paid. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, called him personally. "Frank," he'd said, his voice smooth as butter, "we've been looking at your financials. You've got a lot of equity in your land. With prices what they are, now's the time to expand. The Miller farm could easily support another 160 acres. We can make the financing very attractive." Frank listened politely, but the offer made him uneasy. He saw the frenzy around him, his neighbors taking on debt that would have given their fathers nightmares. He saw the brand new pickups in town, the expensive vacations, the confidence that this boom would last forever. But Frank had his father's voice in his head, a constant reminder: the land gives and the land takes. Never bet more than you can afford to lose. So he said no. He used his profits to pay off his operating note for the year in a single lump sum. He paid cash up front for all his seed, fertilizer, and fuel for the following spring, locking in the prices before they could inflate further. And with the money that was left, he didn't buy more land. He built a new workshop, a proper one, with a concrete floor, insulated walls, and a big, wood-burning stove in the corner. He ran new wiring and installed bright fluorescent lights. For the first time, he'd be able to work on his equipment in the winter without freezing his fingers to the wrenches. To his neighbors, it looked like he was playing small ball. They saw Peterson putting up massive new grain bins and buying the farm next door, and they saw Frank Miller building a glorified garage. They saw him as a man stuck in the past, too timid to grab his piece of the pie. A failure, almost. One afternoon at the diner, the feeling was palpable. Peterson was holding court in a corner booth, surrounded by other farmers and the bank president, Mr. Abernathy. Frank was sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. "It's simple economics," Peterson was saying, gesturing with a fork. "The bank's loaning money at 7%. Inflation's running at 10%. They're basically paying you to take the money. You'd be a fool not to leverage every asset you have." Abernathy nodded eagerly. "Richard's right. This is a paradigm shift, a new era of agriculture." Peterson saw Frank sitting at the counter and strolled over, clapping him on the shoulder with a heavy hand. "Frank, just the man. I was just telling these fellas, you got to spend money to make money. You still running that old museum piece, that Gleaner?" Frank took a slow sip of his coffee. She still cuts beans, Rich." "I'm sure she does," Peterson said, with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "But you could do so much more. A man with your work ethic, with a new machine, you could double your acreage. Look, Abernathy here would write you a loan for a new combine tomorrow. That old thing of yours would probably cover the down payment." All eyes in the diner were on Frank. He felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their modern, progressive thinking clashing with his old-fashioned caution. "I appreciate the thought, Rich," Frank said, setting his cup down carefully. "But I like sleeping at night. And I sleep better when I know the machines in my shed belong to me, not the bank." Peterson's smile tightened. He shook his head, as if dealing with a child. "Suit yourself, Frank, but don't come crying when you get left behind." He walked back to his booth, and the laughter and loud talk resumed. Frank paid for his coffee and left. Driving home in his old Chevy, he passed Peterson's farm. The new Steiger tractor was parked out front, its enormous dual tires casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. It looked powerful, invincible. For a moment, a sliver of doubt crept into Frank's mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool, a relic from a bygone age, too scared to take a risk. He turned onto the gravel road leading to his own place. His farm looked small, quiet, almost humble in comparison. But as he pulled into his yard, he saw his new workshop, its fresh pine siding glowing in the golden light. He saw his 4020 and his old gleaner sitting inside, sheltered and paid for. A sense of calm settled over him. That night, he sat in his armchair, listening to the news on the radio. The announcer's voice was grim, talking about an oil embargo by a group of countries he'd never heard of, called OPEC. He talked about gas lines, soaring inflation, and the prime interest rate, a number Frank had never paid much attention to, starting a slow, ominous climb. It was all happening a world away, it seemed. But as he looked out the window at the dark, silent fields, Frank felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was the feeling a farmer gets when he sees a dark cloud on the horizon on a perfectly clear day. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any banker's promise, that nothing, especially not 7% money, lasts forever. The reckoning was coming. The boom years rolled on, loud and prosperous. The mid-70s were a golden age, written in diesel fumes and flowing grain. For men like Rich Peterson, every year was better than the last. He bought another 80 acres, then 160. His operation was a marvel of modern efficiency, a sprawling enterprise run on leverage and the seemingly endless demand for American corn and soybeans. Frank, meanwhile, just kept farming. He tilled his own ground, fixed his own machinery in his new, warm workshop, and watched the world go mad from a safe distance. He paid his property taxes, put money in the bank, and slept soundly. The whispers at the diner had long since faded. He was just Frank, a fixture of the landscape, unchanging as the oak tree on the county line. Then came the summer of '78. It started subtly. The spring rains were sparse, and the corn was slow to come up. By June, the sun was a merciless white disk in a hazy, cloudless sky. The heat settled over the fields like a physical weight. The corn leaves, which should have been broad and green, began to curl inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They called it pineappling. It was a bad sign. By July, the ponds had shrunk, their edges cracking into intricate patterns of dried mud. The creeks slowed to a trickle. The dust from the gravel roads hung in the air for hours, a permanent brown fog that coated every surface. Frank felt the drought in his bones. He worked from before dawn until after dusk, cultivating to keep a dust mulch on the surface, trying to save what little moisture was left in the soil. His old 4020 tractor, with its simple, reliable diesel engine, chugged along without complaint. It didn't have air conditioning. The heat in the open operator's station was stifling, the sun beating down on the metal hood, the engine's warmth washing over him. He'd come in at night covered in a paste of sweat and dirt, so tired he could barely eat. But the tractor ran. When a hydraulic line blew, he drove to town, bought a new one for $12, and had it fixed in an hour. For Peterson, the drought was a different kind of problem. His massive Steiger Panther, pulling a 50-foot field cultivator, was a thirsty beast. The OPEC embargo had sent fuel prices into the stratosphere. Diesel, which had been 30 cents a gallon a few years ago, was now pushing $1. Filling the Steiger's massive saddle tanks was a $400 proposition, an expense he had to endure every other day. His center pivot irrigation systems, which he'd installed on his newest ground, ran 24 hours a day, the big diesel pumps at their hearts gulping fuel, pulling water from an aquifer that was dropping by the day. His costs were spiraling out of control, even as his crops withered. The first real crack in Peterson's empire appeared in early October, right as harvest began. His 2-year-old John Deere 7720 combine, the pride of his fleet, quit dead in the middle of a cornfield. It wasn't a simple mechanical failure, not a belt or a chain that Frank could have diagnosed by sound. The digital tachometer on the dash went blank, and a complex series of hydraulic functions simply stopped working. Peterson spent a day with the manual, his frustration mounting in the oppressive heat. He called the dealership. They sent out their top mechanic, a young man who plugged a diagnostic tool into a port under the console. Frank saw the scene as he drove past on his way to town. The green behemoth sat silent in the field, surrounded by men staring at it, as if it were a fallen spaceship. The mechanic had the side panels off, revealing a bewildering maze of wires, solenoids, and hydraulic blocks that looked more like the inside of a television than a farm machine. The verdict came 2 days later, overheard at the parts counter. A main electronic control module had failed. There wasn't one in stock in the entire state. The part was on back order from the factory in Moulin, with a 2-week lead time, minimum. Peterson was apoplectic. Every day his corn stood in the field, the dry ears shelled out on the ground, losing him bushels, losing him money he desperately needed. He tried to rent a combine, but with the drought shrinking everyone's yields, farmers were trying to get their own crops out as fast as possible. There were no machines to be had. For 2 weeks, Peterson's harvest sat at a standstill, while Frank's old Gleaner E chugged away. She was slow. She was dusty. The cab was hot. But she ran. He finished his own stunted bean crop, the yield half of what it should have been. But it was something. It was his. He started on his corn, the old machine rattling and groaning, but steadily filling the grain truck. He was a tortoise in a world of hares, and one by one, the hares were starting to pull up lame. When Peterson finally got his part, and his machine running again, a week of autumn rain moved in, turning his fields to mud and delaying him even further. The confident smirk Frank remembered from the auction was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried scowl. The golden boy was starting to look tarnished. The winter that followed was grim. The poor harvest had left everyone short on cash. The news on the radio was a constant drone of economic misery. Inflation was out of control. To fight it, the Federal Reserve, under a new chairman named Paul Volcker, began to aggressively raise the prime interest rate. The number, which had been a sleepy single digit for years, started to climb with terrifying speed. 9%, 12, 15. By the spring of 1980, it was approaching 20%. For Frank, the number was an abstraction. He had no loans. He had money in the bank from the good years, a cushion he'd built instead of buying more land. He paid cash for his seed and fertilizer, wincing at the inflated prices. But he paid it. He was solvent. For Rich Peterson and a generation of farmers like him, the rising interest rate was a dagger. Their entire operations were built on variable rate loans. The 7% money they had borrowed so eagerly just a few years before was now 21% money. The payments on his land and machinery, once manageable, had tripled. It was like trying to run up a down escalator that was speeding up with every step. The breaking point came that fall. Peterson had a good crop, but it didn't matter. Commodity prices had softened, and his input costs were astronomical. When his operating note came due at the Farmers' National Bank, he couldn't pay it. Not just the interest, but the principal. Mr. Abernathy, the banker who had once toasted Peterson's genius, was now a different man. His own neck was on the line, and the easygoing friend was replaced by a grim-faced professional. He gave Peterson 90 days. The whole county held its breath. Richard Peterson, the man who was supposed to be the future of farming, was going under. He tried to sell off some land, but the market was collapsing. Land that had been worth $2,000 an acre was now struggling to fetch $800, and there were no buyers. Everyone was broke. His only option was the one thing every farmer dreads more than drought or flood: the auction. It was scheduled for a cold, grey Saturday in March of 1981. The day was almost a perfect echo of the Henderson sale years before, but the mood was entirely different. There was no sense of opportunity, only a deep, pervasive sorrow. It wasn't just Peterson's farm on the block. It felt like the whole dream of the 70s was being sold off for scrap. Frank went, just as he'd gone to the Henderson sale. He parked his old Chevy C10 next to rows of other muddy pickups. The crowd was huge but quiet. They were there to watch a tragedy, to see the mighty fall, and perhaps to wonder who would be next. Peterson's magnificent line of equipment was all there, polished and gleaming one last time under the weak sun. The Steiger Panther, the John Deere 7720, the fleet of tractors and plows, they looked like monuments to a forgotten empire. Frank saw Peterson standing by the porch of the farmhouse his father had built. He looked 10 years older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. His wife stood beside him, her arms crossed, trying and failing to hold back tears. The auctioneer started, his voice lacking its usual boisterous energy. He knew these were funeral rites. The bidding was slow, pathetic. The big Steiger, which had cost Peterson over $100,000, sold for $30,000 to an out-of-state implement dealer. The 7720 Combine went for a fraction of its value. Piece by piece, the empire was dismantled. Frank didn't bid. He just stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, a silent witness. He watched as they got to the smaller items, the tools from the workshop. He saw a heavy-duty floor jack, a good one, go for $20. He saw a nearly new acetylene torch set sell for $50. These were the tools of a man who had intended to maintain his own future. Now they were being scattered to the winds. The final piece to be sold was the land itself, broken into parcels. The home farm, the original 160 acres with the house and the barns that Peterson's grandfather had raised, was the last lot. The auctioneer began his chant, but the crowd was silent. No one had the money. The only bidder was a man in a suit, a representative from a life insurance company in Des Moines that was buying up distressed farmland. Frank felt something shift inside him. He saw the look on Peterson's face as this stranger from a city office prepared to buy his family's legacy. This wasn't right. He thought of his own farm, the land his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. He thought of the workshop he'd built, the tools that were an extension of his own hands. This was more than just dirt and buildings. It was a life. Before he even knew what he was doing, he heard his own voice cut through the silence. "I'll bid." The auctioneer's head snapped up. "I've got a bid from Frank Miller." The man in the suit looked over, annoyed. He raised his paddle. The price went up. Frank bid again. The two of them went back and forth, the price climbing in small, painful increments. The crowd murmured. Frank Miller, the man who never borrowed a dime, was bidding on the Peterson home place. Frank wasn't thinking about acres or profit margins. He was thinking about the $90 he'd clenched in his fist at the Henderson sale, about the pride of owning something free and clear. He had his savings, the cushion he'd so carefully built. He knew his limit. The price reached a point that made his stomach clench. It was nearly everything he had. The man in the suit conferred with someone on a cell phone the size of a brick. He looked at Frank, then at the auctioneer, and with a slight shake of his head, he lowered his paddle. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his voice filled with relief. "To Frank Miller." A quiet cheer went through the crowd. It wasn't for Frank's victory, but for the stranger's defeat. The farm was staying local. It was staying in the hands of a farmer. Frank walked to the clerk's table, his legs feeling unsteady, and signed the papers. He had just spent his life savings. Later that afternoon, as the last of the buyers hauled away their purchases and the crowd dispersed, Frank walked over to the farmhouse. Rich Peterson was sitting on the steps, his head in his hands. He looked up as Frank approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and disbelief. "Come to gloat, Frank?" he asked, his voice rough. "Come to tell me you told me so?" Frank shook his head. He sat down on the step below Peterson, the worn wood groaning under his weight. For a long time, neither man spoke. They just watched the sun dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the now empty farmyard. "I'm not selling the house, Rich," Frank said finally, his voice quiet. "Or the barns. The land. I'm going to farm the land. But the home place, it should stay with the family that built it." Peterson stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you and your family staying here," Frank said, looking out at the fields. "I'll need help farming this extra ground. I can't do it all myself. I'll pay you a fair wage, and you can rent the house from me for $1 a year. It's your home." Tears welled in Rich Peterson's eyes. The arrogance, the pride, it all washed away, leaving behind a broken man. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, a single jerky motion. "Why, Frank?" he finally managed to whisper. "After everything. After how I treated you." Frank picked up a small stone from the ground, turning it over and over in his calloused fingers. "Because this isn't about you and me," he said. "It's about the land, and about neighbors. In the good times, it's easy to forget that. But when the winter comes, we're all we've got." The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis of the 80s reshaped the landscape of rural America. Many farms were lost, consolidated into corporate holdings. But in Frank's corner of Illinois, a different story unfolded. Frank and Rich worked side by side. The old rivalries were forgotten, replaced by a shared purpose. Rich, humbled and stripped of his ambition, rediscovered the simple love of farming he'd had as a boy. He was a good worker, and he knew the land. Frank, in turn, learned from Rich's knowledge of newer seed hybrids and farming techniques. Together, they made the combined farms profitable, even in the tough times. The talk in the diner changed. Frank Miller was no longer the cautious old-timer. He was a pillar of the community, a man of quiet wisdom. Farmers started coming to him for advice, not about finances, but about how to fix a worn-out planter unit, or how to get another season out of a tired old tractor. His workshop, the one he'd built with the boom year profits, became an unofficial community center, a place where men could share knowledge, borrow a specialized tool, or just have a cup of coffee by the wood stove and talk through a problem. The philosophy of get big or get out was dead. The new mantra, unspoken but understood, was stay solvent and help your neighbor. Frank never got bigger. He and Rich farmed the 2 homesteads, and that was enough. He kept his John Deere 40-20, rebuilding the engine himself when it finally got tired. And in the back of the main shed, under a tarp, sat the old Gleaner E. He bought a newer, used combine in the late 80s, a Massey Ferguson with a comfortable cab, but he never got rid of the Gleaner. It was a reminder. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Frank was in the workshop with his grandson, a boy of 12, with curious eyes and hands that were already learning their way around a set of wrenches. They were working on a small Briggs & Stratton engine from a lawn mower. "Grandpa," the boy asked, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag, "why do you keep that old silver combine? It just takes up space." Frank stopped what he was doing and looked over at the shape under the tarp. He walked over and pulled the canvas back, revealing the faded paint and peeling decals of the Gleaner. The machine sat silent, a sleeping giant from another time. He ran his hand over the cold metal of the header. "This old machine," he said, his voice soft, "taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about having the newest or the biggest or the fastest. It's about owning what you have. It's about knowing how to fix it when it breaks. It's about being independent." He pointed to the main separator drive, to the heavy cast-iron sheave he'd pulled from a salvage yard all those years ago. "See this part? There was a time when my whole year, everything we had, depended on this one piece of old iron. Your grandma and I, we survived a very hard time because this machine, this old, obsolete, paid-for machine, kept running when all the brand new ones had quit." He looked at his grandson, his eyes serious. "Some people will tell you that success is about how much you can borrow, how big you can get. But true wealth, son, is owing nothing to anyone. It's the freedom you find in this workshop, with your own 2 hands. Don't you ever forget that." The boy looked from his grandfather's weathered face to the old combine, and then back again. He didn't fully understand all of it. Not yet. But he understood the look in his grandfather's eyes. He understood the feel of the cold steel and the smell of old grease. And he knew, with a certainty that would shape the rest of his life, that he was standing on solid ground. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves of the cornstalks in the harvested fields, a timeless sound carrying the promise of another season, another generation, and a lesson learned in the heart of the land.